You wouldn't believe it if I told you, but there was a time when the Australian army took on a bunch of overgrown chickens. The Great Emu War of 1932 wasn't just some wildlife management problem. It was an actual war. And mate, let me tell you, we lost. It all started with a noise. Have you ever heard thousands of emus thundering across a field? It sounds like a storm rolling in, only it doesn't stop. 1 minute, you're standing in your wheat field, proud of the crop you barely managed to grow during the worst of times. And the next, you're watching those giant, feathered menaces tear through it like it's a free buffet. After World War I, many Australian veterans were granted farmland in Western Australia to grow crops under the soldier settlement scheme. By the early 1930s, emus, large, flightless birds native to Australia, began migrating from inland regions to the coastal areas during their breeding season. These migrations coincided with the farmers' wheat harvest. The emus, numbering in the tens of thousands, invaded farmlands in search of food and water, causing significant damage to crops and fences. Their presence not only destroyed wheat fields but also allowed rabbits, another pest, to enter the farms through broken fences. This happened during the Great Depression, when wheat prices were already low and the farmers were struggling to make ends meet. The damage caused by the emus added to their hardships. Picture this: Australia's wheat belt. The land was tough, and so were we. A bunch of us veterans, fresh out of World War I, had been promised fertile farmland by the government. Grow wheat, they said. Help rebuild the economy. We gave it our all, but the Great Depression was strangling wheat prices. To add insult to injury, the moment our crops were ready, an army of emus showed up, as if they'd been lying in wait, planning their attack. These weren't just a few stray birds, mind you. We're talking thousands. They came down from the hills, streaming across the fields like a feathery tidal wave. They devoured everything in their path: wheat, water, hope, and left the land looking like a battlefield. And the fences? Useless. They smashed through them like they were twigs, letting the blasted rabbits in too. It was as if the land itself had turned against us. We tried everything to stop them. Traps, dogs, even our own rifles. But emus are smarter than they look. They'd scatter the moment we got close, moving like coordinated units, dodging bullets like feathered ninjas. It didn't take long for us to realize we were outmatched. It started slowly, almost like nature was giving us a warning. At first, it was just a few emus poking around the edges of the wheat fields, their long necks bobbing up and down like periscopes as they scoped out the scene. But within a week, a couple turned into a couple hundred. By the end of the month, we were looking at an emu army, a feathery force of chaos, clucking and honking as they marched across the land, devouring crops like there was no tomorrow. They weren't just eating the wheat. They were wrecking the fences, trampling the fields, and leaving destruction in their wake. The problem wasn't just their numbers. It was their attitude. These weren't your average birds. No, these emus had an air about them, a cocky strut that made you think they knew exactly what they were doing. We tried setting up scarecrows, but the birds didn't scare. They just stood next to them, like they'd found a new friend. We even went to the extent of calling on the Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes, for help, but we got no response. I think they might have been busy back then. The town meeting where it all began was held in the old community hall, a rickety wooden building that usually hosted dances and bingo nights. That night, though, it was filled with red-faced farmers, all shouting over each other about how to deal with the emus. "They're eating us out of house and home," Ted bellowed, slamming his hat on the table. "I spent a week planting that wheat, and they cleared it out in 2 days." "You're lucky," another farmer muttered. "They flattened my whole paddock just running around like it was a bloody racetrack." Mick, of course, couldn't resist adding his 2 cents. "Maybe they're just training for the Emu Olympics. Gold medal in wheat consumption, silver in fence destruction." The room erupted into frustrated groans, though a few folks couldn't help but laugh. After hours of arguing and ridiculous suggestions, like unleashing a plague of feral cats or bribing the emus with a pile of barley, someone, probably in desperation, suggested getting the government involved. "They've got soldiers, don't they? Machine guns? Let's see how those birds handle that." At first, everyone thought it was a joke. Machine guns? For birds? But then the idea started to sink in. By the end of the meeting, the motion had passed. The farmers, frustrated by the devastation and their inability to control the emus with their own resources, turned to the Australian government for help. They appealed to the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, for military assistance. And surprisingly, he answered. Sir George Pearce approved the use of soldiers and military equipment, viewing it as a way to assist the struggling farmers and perhaps even test military weaponry. In November 1932, a small military force led by Captain Jack Sparrow, Major GPW Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was sent to the region. The operation involved 2 soldiers armed with Lewis guns, light machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The goal was to reduce the emu population and protect the crops. However, the Emu War became infamous due to the Army's inability to effectively deal with the highly mobile and resilient emus, resulting in a bizarre and largely unsuccessful campaign. A few weeks later, the soldiers arrived. They arrived in town looking sharp, their uniforms pressed and boots polished. There were only 2 of them, a sergeant and a private, but they brought with them the crown jewel of military might, a shiny black machine gun mounted on a tripod. They were here to deal with what the government had called an emu problem. To us farmers, it wasn't just a problem, it was a crisis. When they pulled up in their truck, the farmers gathered around, staring at the weapon like it was a miracle sent from heaven. The emus had already proven themselves more clever and more relentless than anyone expected. Would machine guns really make a difference? Their first exercise was simple enough. Learn how to aim at something that moves. They set up wooden targets shaped vaguely like emus, their long necks painted yellow for visibility. It should have been easy, but the soldiers struggled to hit even stationary targets. One burst of gunfire sent dirt flying, but the wooden emu didn't even wobble. The men muttered and adjusted their sights, but the results didn't improve much. Then came the movement drills. A soldier with a sack over his head pretended to be an emu, zigzagging across the field while the other tried to track him with their rifles. Watching him dart left and right, I couldn't help but think of the real emus I'd seen in the fields. Fast, unpredictable, and impossible to corner. They didn't zigzag because they wanted to. They zigzagged because they could. The next morning, as the soldiers prepared for their first battle, Mick leaned against the fence, chewing on a piece of straw. You know, he said to no one in particular, if this goes south, we're going to be the laughingstock of the country. Farmers and soldiers outsmarted by birds. Just imagine the headlines. I laughed nervously, but part of me wondered if he was right. The first battle took place in the wide-open paddocks just outside town. The soldiers had spent the morning setting up the machine gun in a clearing, positioning it like they were about to take on an army of invading troops, which, I guess, wasn't too far from the truth. The emus arrived just after lunch. At first, it was a handful of them, pecking around the edges of the field. Then more came, and more. Within minutes, the horizon seemed to ripple with movement as hundreds of birds closed in, their necks bobbing like they were marching to war. When the birds were about 50 meters away, the gunner opened fire. The rattle of the machine gun echoed across the paddock, and for a moment, it looked like the emus might panic. A few of them scattered, honking in alarm. But then, like some kind of unholy choreography, the flock split into smaller groups and began zigzagging through the field. The gunner tried to keep up, swinging the gun left and right, but the emus were too fast, too unpredictable. They're flanking us, one shouted, though I wasn't sure if they were joking or serious. Meanwhile, the sergeant was yelling himself hoarse, trying to maintain control. Steady, aim for the groups. But the emus weren't playing by the rules. They darted through the scrub, dodging bullets like they'd trained with the best military tacticians in the country. A few even seemed to taunt the soldiers, stopping just long enough to let out a low, mocking honk before dashing away again. By the time the gunfire stopped, the field was empty save for a few feathers fluttering in the breeze. The emus had vanished into the bush, leaving behind a trail of trampled grass and humiliated soldiers. The soldiers were determined to turn the tide after their first humiliating defeat. The sergeant, looking slightly worse for wear, announced his new plan with the confidence of a man who had absolutely not learned from his mistakes. We're going mobile, he said, standing in front of the farmers. The problem yesterday was that we were stuck in one place. Today, we're mounting the machine gun on the back of a truck. We'll chase them down." Mick, leaning against the pub wall, raised an eyebrow. "A truck? What's next, mate?" "Calling in the Air Force." But when we look back at it, calling the Air Force wouldn't have been a bad idea. Picture this: a bunch of fighter planes laying ruins to your wheat farm, destroying all your crops. That doesn't sound bad, does it? The next morning, the plan was put into action. The soldiers loaded up their trusty machine gun onto the back of a rickety old flatbed truck. The private climbed into the bed, gripping the mounted gun like a hero in a war movie, while the sergeant took the driver's seat. The first emu sighting came not long after the truck sputtered into the paddock. A small group of birds was grazing near the edge of the field, their heads popping up like sentries when they heard the engine. "There they are," the private yelled, swinging the gun into position. The sergeant floored the accelerator, and the truck lurched forward with all the grace of a drunk kangaroo. The private opened fire, but the combination of the bumpy terrain and the sergeant's erratic driving made it impossible to aim. The emus, naturally, scattered in every direction. Some dashed into the bush, others zigzagged across the field, and one particularly bold bird ran directly in front of the truck, forcing the sergeant to swerve. It didn't take long for disaster to strike. The sergeant, too focused on chasing the emus, didn't see the ditch until it was too late. The truck hit the edge and tipped forward, throwing the private and the machine gun into the mud. And the emus? They were standing on a nearby ridge, watching the chaos unfold like spectators at a sporting event. One of them let out a low honking noise, and I swear it sounded like laughter. By the 5th day of the campaign, morale was as low as the wheat yield, and the emus were still strutting around like they owned the place, which at this point, they sort of did. The soldiers had tried everything: ambushes, chase tactics, even some half-baked plan involving decoy crops, don't ask. Nothing worked. The emus were too fast, too clever, and far too organized. They were, as Mick put it, the feathered generals of the bush. And so, they did what no soldier ever wants to do. They surrendered. The next day, they marched out into the field with a white flag. I didn't believe it would work, but when the emus came, they didn't charge. They just stood there, their leader, a massive bird with a scar across its neck, stepping forward. I swear on my life, it nodded when the major spoke. He promised we'd leave them alone, that the farmers would find another way. In return, the emus wouldn't raid the field so long as they were left untouched. It felt absurd, but when the major extended his hand, the leader of the emus pecked at the ground, like it was sealing the deal. A treaty was drawn up later that week, signed by both sides, our government on one, and a muddy print from the emu leader on the other. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be with the emus still roaming the fields like victorious conquerors. The government quietly abandoned the operation, and the farmers were left to deal with the birds on their own. Every now and then, someone brings up the Emu War, and I see people laughing like it's some big joke. But those of us who lived through it know the truth. I'll never forget the way they stared us down, their long necks craning like they owned the land. Or how Mick, ever the joker, swore one emu winked at him after it dodged a bullet. So, yeah, call it a funny story if you want. But just remember, there's a reason we don't mess with emus anymore. We tried war, and we lost. And to this day, whenever I see one of those giant birds, I nod respectfully. You don't mess with nature's war machines, mate. Not unless you fancy losing your crops and your dignity.